A commercial pilot is trained for years, sits in front of a cockpit packed with satellite-linked instruments, and can still feel a small jolt of genuine anxiety the moment the autopilot disconnects and the flight management system stops telling them exactly where to go. That anxiety isn't incompetence. It's a fairly rational response to a skill that hasn't been exercised nearly as often as the training records might suggest, buried underneath thousands of hours of flight time that were, in the moment-to-moment sense that actually matters, handled almost entirely by a machine. Now picture a sailor standing on a canoe made of lashed wood and coconut fiber, no engine, no compass, no chart, crossing 2,000 miles of open Pacific Ocean and arriving, on purpose, at a single island a few miles wide, using nothing but a lifetime of memorized stars, ocean swells, and the movements of birds. The gap between those two skill sets isn't about intelligence, and it isn't really about technology either. It's about what each system was actually built to remember, and what happens to a skill once something else agrees to remember it instead. Start with what traditional Pacific navigators were working with, because the method itself sounds almost impossibly minimal. No instruments, no charts, no compass, just the sky, the ocean, and a navigator's memory. Ethnographic field studies conducted on the island of Puyallup in the mid-20th century, documenting one of the last intact traditional navigation systems still actively practiced, found that master navigators held an entire mental almanac of roughly 32 stars, memorized well enough to know exactly where each one rose and set along the horizon on any given night of the year. That system had a name, the star compass. Instead of dividing the horizon into the arbitrary degrees of a modern compass rose, navigators divided it into houses, each one marked by the point where a specific star or constellation reliably broke the horizon at dusk or dropped below it at dawn. The houses weren't evenly spaced in a mathematical sense the way compass degrees are. They were spaced according to where the stars themselves actually appeared, learned through years of simply watching the sky night after night until the pattern became second nature. The same way a longtime resident of a city doesn't need street signs to know which direction downtown lies. To hold a course, a navigator didn't stare at a needle. They picked a star sitting in the correct house and steered toward it. And when that star climbed too high in the sky to use for direction, they simply shifted to the next star scheduled to rise in the same house, and the one after that, walking a chain of stars across the entire night, the way you might follow a series of streetlights down an unfamiliar road, each one handing off guidance to the next before it faded from usefulness. On overcast nights, when no stars were visible at all, the same navigators reportedly fell back on a hierarchy of secondary cues layered underneath the star compass, including the direction of prevailing swells, the feel of wind on the skin, and even the flight patterns of certain seabirds known to roost on specific islands and travel predictable distances out to sea each day to feed. Steering was only half the problem, though. The far stranger piece of the system was how these navigators tracked distance and position without anything resembling a chart. Researchers studying Micronesian wayfinding documented a mental technique now generally referred to by its native term, etak, and it inverts the entire logic of a modern map. Instead of picturing their own canoe as the object moving across a fixed grid of ocean, navigators mentally fixed their canoe in place and pictured a reference island, invisible over the horizon, sliding backward beneath them as the voyage progressed. Position wasn't tracked as coordinates on a chart. It was tracked as a constantly updating relationship to an unseen landmark, reasoned out through the memorized angle to a specific star house, the felt rhythm of the swell moving under the hull, and the accumulated hours spent holding a particular heading. A full voyage might be broken into a sequence of these etak segments, each one representing the moment the invisible reference island was judged to have shifted from one star house to the next relative to the canoe, giving the navigator a running sense of progress without ever needing a single number, a printed chart, or a straight line drawn on paper. A navigator could reportedly sense a hidden island long before it was visible, from patterns in how ocean swells refracted and bent around it from many miles away, essentially reading a landmass through the shape it left behind in the water, a skill documented among some traditional navigators as distinguishing as many as half a dozen distinct swell patterns crossing and interfering with one another at once. None of this depended on a single piece of external equipment. The entire system lived inside one person's trained memory, refined over years of apprenticeship, carried physically from teacher to student with nothing written down, because nothing needed to be. The navigator was, in a very real sense, the instrument. Now bring that same question into a modern cockpit, because the contrast turns out to run deeper than simply old methods versus new tools. Aviation safety investigations following a string of high-profile crashes in the past 2 decades converged on a strikingly specific concern, one serious enough that it now shows up repeatedly in official industry safety reports. A measurable erosion of pilots' manual flying and raw navigational skill, tied directly to how much of modern flight has been handed over to automation. Surveys and internal reviews conducted by aviation regulators found that many commercial pilots spend as little as a few minutes of actual hands-on flying per flight, with the overwhelming majority of any given trip, from shortly after takeoff to shortly before landing, managed entirely by autopilot and flight management computers. Over a career spanning thousands of flights, that adds up to remarkably little cumulative time spent doing the raw tasks pilots are, in principle, ultimately responsible for and trained to fall back on in an emergency. One widely studied 2009 accident, in which a commercial jet crashed into the Atlantic Ocean after a relatively minor and recoverable sensor malfunction, was found by investigators to have stemmed largely from confusion once the autopilot disengaged and the flight crew was suddenly required to hand-fly the aircraft using raw instrument readings, a skill that modern training schedules, heavily built around automated systems, had left comparatively under-exercised. The aircraft itself was never in a condition that made recovery impossible. Investigators concluded that basic decades-old manual flying technique, if applied correctly and immediately, would very likely have prevented the crash entirely. The failure wasn't mechanical. It was a gap between the skill the moment demanded and the skill that years of automated flying had left available. Aviation training circles eventually coined a phrase for the underlying pattern, calling affected pilots children of the magenta line, a reference to the bright magenta path drawn across a cockpit's navigation display, showing exactly where the automated flight system intends to fly. The phrase started as an internal industry joke and gradually became shorthand used in serious safety discussions and pilot training reform proposals, precisely because it captured something regulators kept finding in accident data but had struggled to name cleanly. The concern wasn't that the technology itself was unsafe. It was that an entire generation of pilots had learned to follow that glowing line with remarkable precision while gradually losing the underlying skill of independently reasoning through where the aircraft actually was in space and where it needed to go next, without a screen telling them directly. Some airlines responded by quietly rewriting training programs to deliberately force pilots back into manual flight more often during routine, low-risk conditions, specifically so the underlying skill wouldn't atrophy from disuse, treating manual flying almost like a muscle that needed scheduled exercise to avoid weakening. That's the same gap sitting underneath the Pacific navigator and the modern airline pilot, just wearing a different century's technology. A star compass and an etak reference frame forced the navigator's brain to constantly build and rebuild a working model of position, direction, and motion from raw sensory information, because there was no other option available, no backup system waiting to take over the instant attention wandered. A magenta line on a flight display quietly removes that requirement altogether, letting a pilot arrive safely at a destination thousands of times in a row without ever being forced to construct that same internal model, right up until the one moment a system fails and the model isn't there to fall back on. This isn't a case for scrapping GPS or grounding autopilots, and it isn't really an argument that older methods were somehow superior in any absolute sense. Automated flight has made aviation dramatically safer, on average, than it has ever been in history, and no reasonable sailor would trade a working satellite receiver for a lifetime of star memorization if the receiver were actually available and reliable. What the comparison exposes instead is something narrower and more useful. A skill only stays sharp if the environment keeps demanding it. The star compass survived for centuries not because Pacific navigators had access to some technology modern pilots lack, but because their environment gave them no alternative to building deep, redundant, internal expertise. Remove that requirement, hand the job to an external system instead, and the underlying skill doesn't necessarily vanish overnight. It simply stops being exercised quietly, one automated flight at a time, until the exact moment it's needed most and isn't there. So the next time a piece of automation quietly takes a task off your hands, whether it's a flight computer, a GPS app, or something far smaller, it's worth asking a version of the question aviation safety investigators eventually had to ask about their own industry. Not whether the tool works, because it almost certainly does, but what skill, exactly, you've quietly stopped practicing because the tool has been doing it for you, and whether you'd still be able to find your way home if, just once, it stopped working in the middle of the ocean. The Pacific navigator's advantage was never magic, and it wasn't some ability modern humans have lost the capacity for. It was simply the product of an environment that never once let the underlying skill go quiet, night after night, voyage after voyage, for as long as the tradition survived.